Buenos días a todos. Esta es la primera sesión de la parte de modelación del Congreso del CIMAC 2022. En la primera charla tenemos al profesor Ezio Venturino, que nos va a estar hablando de a grassland metaecoepidemic model with just consumers migration. Adelante, profesor.
Ok, gracias. Creo que es mejor si hablo en inglés, ok? ¿Está bien? Okay, so I'm presenting, I'm going to present this paper which has been written together with my friends and collaborators in France, Thibaut Moulin and Antoine Perrasso. And I'm going to illustrate first the biological model and then the model that I propose to consider this situation. And the model is composed of several parts, so I'm going to analyze the simplest parts of it at first, and then I'm going to couple the patches and study a more complicated model from the demographic point of view, and then the full model which contains also disease. So it's a rather complicated situation. And then I'm going to show some behaviors and discuss the results. Okay, the biological problem is produced by the fact that plant pathogens, the incorporation of plant pathogens into the models is one of the most important priorities in the European programs. And the point is that the plant diversity, by the way, I heard on TV that Costa Rica is probably the first nation in the world that has the highest biodiversity. Here in Europe, we are in a worse situation. So the problem is that one way of fighting disease plants is to ensure that in the fields there is a sufficient plant diversity, because that is a way of reducing the infections by fungus, for example. And the fact that if the fields are intensely exploited or abandoned, this causes a reduction in the species diversity. What we are going to consider here are two grasslands, two fields with different conditions, species richness, and growing rates and carrying capacities. And in addition, we assume that herbivores can move from one patch to the other and graze freely in the two. Okay. The first patch is more resilient to the external disease because it has a high plant diversity. The second one has been exploited or overexploited, so it's weaker to parasites attacks and fungal diseases. In addition, it may be sprayed by fertilizers, and this contributes also to reducing to increasing the carrying capacity, but also to reduce, the species insect diversity, and this may be a problem. Herbivores are assumed to be able to distinguish healthy and infected plants. Infected plants means that they are attacked by fungi, and herbivores can consume both of them, but from the infected plants have less food with a lesser quality. And instead, in the first patch, because there is no fertilization, we have a higher functional diversity. And so the new model is made by two patches, 1 and 2. There are the healthy plants S1 and S2 in each one of them. And of course, S represents the abundance of the plant population. There is an infected population in the second patch. The disease transmission occurs via mass action, which is the simplest way of modeling a disease spread. And it's caused by natural causes like wind or water actions. Herbivores can migrate, and Qij means that the migration goes from patch I into patch J. So we reverse the indices to denote the movement. And finally, grazing is formulated by a Holding type 2 response function, which means essentially that there is a feeding saturation. If the diet is always the same, then the individuals become tired of it and so eat less of that. So the mathematical formulation is made by these 5 equations: the plants in patch 1, the plants in patch 2, predators, herbivores in patch 1, herbivores in patch 2, infected plants. So here we have a logistic reproduction coupled for the plants in patch 1, but also for the patch in patch 2. And there is grazing, so the predators eat the plants, so there is a minus sign here in patch 1 according to this law, which is the Holding type 2 response function that I mentioned before. And of course, the predators get a benefit by eating these plants. They also die at rate B. Herbivores can eat only these plants, so they are, if the resource here S1 disappears, they die out. This is a mortality rate, and these are the migration rates between the 2 patches. In patch 2, in addition to for the plants, there is also the disease that recruits individuals from the healthy plants and moves them into the infected ones at rate lambda, and this occurs proportionally to the abundance of infected plants, because more plants mean, in fact, more infected plants mean more fungi and therefore a higher transmission. Disease can be overcome at rate nu, so they go back from I to healthy plants, but the plants can also die, because if they are overcome by the fungi, I mean, fungi eat all of them, and so they die. And in addition, there is grazing, which occurs on the healthy and on the infected plants by the predators that live in that patch. Now, this is a list of the variables and of the parameters, but I'm not going to illustrate it. And with their units and values are hypothetical. In these simulations, we will use hypothetical values for an idealized situation. We can rescale the system via these equations, introducing new parameters. And in particular, the time unit under this transformation becomes the average time of the disease recovery. So the idea is that the system, after these modifications, has a little bit less parameters. You see that here there is 1 and 1. So one parameter here has disappeared, and similarly in some other cases. One can show that the system is bounded. This is an important result because it tells that the population cannot grow to infinity, and this is obtained technically by defining the total environmental population, summing up all the populations that appear in the model, and then summing up these equations and eliminating some negative terms and bounding the positive terms from above. One can write this equation for T, the total population, where theta is an arbitrary positive variable, positive parameter, which has to be taken small enough. And if this is satisfied, then the right-hand side of the system can be bound by this constant that we call m, and therefore, finally, the population is bounded by m over theta, the maximum of m over theta, or the initial population. And so it is bounded by a constant. And because each population is non-negative, if we bound from above the total sum of them, also each one population is bounded. I went over the details, but very quickly. So we can analyze patch 1 in which there is only a resource and consumer, so predator-prey model. There are three equilibria: the origin, which is unstable, the predator-free point with only the resources, only the plants at carrying capacity, and which is always feasible but stable only if the death rate of the predators, of the herbivores, is high enough. And this threshold shows that, I mean, later in the next slide, we will see that there is a transcritical bifurcation, because it is the same condition that appears, the same condition that appears here for the feasibility of the coexistence equilibrium. In addition, there is a new threshold for the parameter R, for which if the growth rate of the grass is too large, then a Hopf bifurcation occurs, and therefore you are going to observe oscillations among plants and herbivores. In patch 2, we analyze the disease dynamics, and in this case there is origin and coexistence, then there is a predator and disease-free point, so only the plants are carrying capacity. And then there are a couple of other equilibria, the one with the disease endemic, so I has a value which is positive, no predators, or the disease-free equilibrium with plants and herbivores. One can state the feasibility and stability conditions for each one of these equilibria, and here two bifurcations, in this case transcritical bifurcations can occur. And also Hopf bifurcation may arise if this condition becomes an inequality. These are more or less known results, but it's important to have them, because when we when we couple the two patches with only demographics and no disease, we can compare the outcome of this model with the two simpler models that we have considered before. There is coexistence. There are 4 predator-free equilibria that show, I mean, 2 of them all unstable, 3 of them the origin as well, and W3, which is which is probably conditionally stable, but there are also equilibria in which the plant population in patch 2 disappears, or the plant population in patch 1 disappears. And note that the predators survive in both patches, and this is due to the fact that those that live in patch 2 with no resource can migrate back into patch 1 to feed. And here it's the same situation. And these are the population values. We can establish feasibility, stability, and I'm not going to dwell on these conditions because there will be a summarizing table later on. But we can analyze it. The migrations destabilize the equilibrium W1 because the migration rates appear in the stability criteria. So migrations play an essential role in the stability of this equilibrium. And similarly for W2, the equilibrium is destabilized also by migrations. W3 appears to be conditionally stable, and it's made of 2 copies of the equilibrium E1 in the previous model. Also, the stability of W3 in the coupled system is more restrictive than the one for the corresponding equilibrium in the single patch. And the reason is because the coupled system contains more equations, and therefore there are most stability conditions to be satisfied, and the more conditions we impose, the more restrictive stability becomes. In some of the equilibria, it's difficult to establish a correspondence. For example, the coupled model coexistence does not have a corresponding equilibrium. The closest one is W4, but W4 needs more conditions for stability. And in general, this can be summarized by saying that if I increase the system complexity, the equilibria become less feasible and stable. and also they are more numerous, they are more larger numbers. So this is the simple model in patch 1 with 3 equilibria, feasibility and stability conditions are summarized here. In patch 2 we have also the disease, so 5 equilibria. The coexistence is not analytically analyzed because it's too complicated. And then I have the coupled model, which has these equilibria. Again, the first 3 do not play any role because they are unconditionally unstable, but the next 3 can be analyzed, while coexistence is too difficult. Can be analyzed only numerically, and we will do it later. Okay, the equilibrium of the full model. Again, we have some equilibria like before, where there are only plants in patch 2, patch 1, or in both patches. Stability conditions can be worked out. Here you have plants and infected plants, so the persistence of the disease in the second patch and nothing else. Then you can have no plants in patch 1, no infection, and the predators surviving in both patches by migrations. And of course, you can analyze feasibility, but then there is a corresponding equilibrium here in which you have the plants only in patch 1, no plants in patch 2, and no disease in patch 2, but predators in both. There is the endemic equilibrium in patch 2 and the plants which are healthy in patch 1. The plants do not migrate, so these two systems are apart from each other and they cannot communicate, and so they persist in this situation. Okay, then there is a disease-free equilibrium with no disease but every other population possible. This equilibrium can be analyzed by looking at the values of the predators as functions theta and pi of the corresponding plants. And these functions are essentially conic sections. When I substitute P1 and P2 into the remaining equilibrium equations, I get 2 conic sections, lambda and gamma, and they can, they can be analyzed if we are able to write the invariants of each conic, which are geometrical entities. And the problem is that, to analyze the cases of hyperbola is not so easy. So I'm considering only the easiest case when both these conic sections are ellipses, and it can be shown that these ellipses have a portion in the first quadrant, so they have intersections with the positive branches of the coordinate axis. And it is not possible that the origin lies inside these ellipses, because we would get, imposing this condition, we would get an inconsistency. And therefore we have to analyze, to assume that lambda contains the origin and gamma does not. And in that case, I don't have a figure, but in that case, the intersection of the two ellipses can be obtained by requiring that the roots of these parabolae and the roots of, the intersection of gamma with the coordinate axis would be the roots of these other parabolae, and the sufficient condition would be, for the intersection, would be an interlacing property of these roots. In other words, we need one root rho in between two roots of zeta. And so zeta is here, and rho is, I think, is somewhere here. Well, I forgot here. Okay. Okay. So this can be characterized by geometrical conditions, and this shows that the equilibrium, the intersection of these conic sections exists, and therefore this equilibrium exists, is feasible. Okay. Then we can analyze QG that contains the disease, and these are the stability conditions. So similarly can be done for QD. I'm not going to go through the details because I have to, go to the latter part of the presentation. So I'm just showing a complicated formula, but that can be derived, and I'm putting them here only because I'm referring to them in this table. So in this table, I have all the possible equilibria, not all the possible ones, but all the ones that can arise, except that the first three, like in the simpler models, are always unstable. All the other ones are conditionally feasible, and except for this one, so the disease, endemic disease in the second patch is an unstable equilibrium, so it cannot arise, but all the other ones are also conditionally stable. And the two more complicated ones need to be analyzed numerically, at least in part, at least for feasibility. Okay, herbivores free equilibria are unconditionally stable, as I said before. The resource only equilibria, so only the plants share the same stability conditions, but in the bigger model, there is one extra condition: the carrying capacity in patch 2 is restricted, and the bound depends on epidemiological parameters. So the disease has importance for the amount of plants that can thrive in patch 2. It can be reduced by the disease. For patch 2 only dynamics, these 2 points have the same feasibility. QB is unconditionally stable, and the whole system has also a patch 1. When patch 1 is present, QB can be stabilized, but becomes another equilibrium in the bigger model, which is called QH. So this is to say that we can give an interpretation of the various situations. For example, the feasibility condition for this point that corresponds to W3 is required, but W3 does not require it. QH has less chances to appear than W3 in the end. And similarly can be said to, with respect to other equilibria that I'm not going to illustrate. For the full ecosystem behavior, here we have to essentially go through simulations. We have found oscillations in the simulations for these parameters and these initial conditions. And this can be seen in figure. So these are the oscillations. Remember that the oscillations are around this point where there is no plants in patch 1. So these are plants in patch 1, herbivores in patch 1, plants in patch 2, infected healthy plants in patch 2, infected plants in patch 2, and herbivores in patch 2. So equilibrium QD contains only the populations herbivores in patch 1, herbivores in patch 2, and plants in patch 2. And I remind you that the herbivores survive because they can migrate here and eat these plants. And this simulation shows that this equilibrium, of course, is not an equilibrium anymore, but the three populations survive through stable, persistent limit cycles. For another situation, when we couple, when we uncouple, the oscillations appear only also among the plants in patch 1. Okay, and here we can find that there are persistent oscillations around QJ that are depicted in this picture and in this picture, but they disappear so this is patch 1 and this is patch 2. The three colors, actually there are only two populations here, so the two colors correspond to the two populations, plants and herbivores. And the fact that you see a stripe means that there are oscillations. Here we have three populations. One is very low, and the other two are the green and the yellow. And so they oscillate with rather large periods. But when we couple in this same situation, so with the same parameter choice, these two patches, these unstable equilibria stabilize. The five populations attain stable, constant values. Okay? And then there are other behaviors. My time is running, so I don't know. Oscillations of all populations in both uncoupled patches reduced by coupling, again, as I said before. And they can, however, remain in the coupled system, but in this situation, you can get also the disease-free situation. So, for example, here you have uncoupled patches, and when you couple, you have patch 1, patch 2, oscillations everywhere. You couple these two patches, you get oscillations for the plants, for the herbivores, but the disease has disappeared. And similarly, you can have oscillations in patch 2, carrying capacity or constant values for plants and herbivores in patch 1. And you get the oscillations in the couple situation. Maybe the captions are reversed, I don't know, but anyway. Okay, there are system bifurcations for which one point becomes another one when one parameter, in this case the disease incidence, disease transmission, reduces below the value 0.3. And you can see it here. So you have lambda here between 0.03 and 0. As you go down, P2 is 0, P1 is 0. The infected plants suddenly become 0 here. The healthy plants in patch 2 from a lower value jump to the carrying capacity. And so past this point, the system does not have the disease anymore. Another situation is, in this case, I think this is probably the same figure to see better the transition, but I can skip that. QE goes to QD, so let's go to the picture. But in this case, it's interesting because in this case, there is a disease-related mortality mu, and you have one equilibrium which, for low values of mu, has no predators in the second patch, no predators in the first patch, no plants in the first patch, and the healthy and infected plants that oscillate. These two graphs show the peak and the trough, the bottom part of the oscillations. And you see if the disease-induced mortality increases, the predators start enter into the system in both patches and start to oscillate in both patches. If you keep on increasing the mortality rate due to the disease, at a certain point, the infected plant disappears and the system persists with oscillating predators here in patch 1, here in patch 2, and oscillating plants in patch 2, while in patch 1 there is nothing. Okay, and another situation is here. I'm not going to illustrate, but it is more or less similar. It involves the oscillations of plants in patch 1, and one other one in which the oscillations appear in the coupled system, and okay, and the disease has disappeared. If I change the mortality rate, the periods of the oscillations change. You can see that they are rather different from what we had here. Okay, we carried out also some sensitivity analysis, which in two cases, I think 2 cases. One is the case in which herbivores prefer healthy plants because they know that they have better energy sources from them. And in this case, sensitivity analysis, okay, I'll skip I want to go to the pictures. Okay, sensitivity analysis is carried out by plotting the equilibrium, if it exists, or the maximum and minimum of the oscillations in the cycles as functions of 2 selected parameters. In this case, I've taken the 2 parameters, the 2 migration parameters of the herbivores. So what you find is patch 1, patch 1 here, patch 2 here, plants, herbivores, plants susceptible, plants that are infected, and herbivores. And you see that if the migration rates, for example, are quite large, both, the herbivores in patch 1 disappear, the herbivores in patch 2 disappear. This is essentially 0 level. There is a stripe here for Q12 small, independently of the other migration rate, where there are oscillations of the plants and of the herbivores. And here of the herbivores, of the infected and the susceptible plants. Of course, this is obtained with hypothetical parameter values that in this case are related to the ones that appear in the unscaled model. So these would be measurable on the field if it were possible to measure them. But what I'm saying is that this information could be important for an applied ecologist because he can play with the model, change the parameters, and see what would the effect of the parameter change entail in the outcome of the model. For instance, in other papers that we had produced, for example, on the European hare, which is a nuisance here in Italy because it's an invasive species that replaces original autochthonous, native species here. We have looked at what happens under possible climatic changes, and this has been done by assuming that, for example, a temperature raise, average temperature raise, entails changes in some or several parameters of the model, in some cases raising them, in some other cases reducing them. And so we have explored how would these pictures change by a change, for example, of 10% in R1 up, and maybe a change of A2 down by 20%, something like that. You would get different pictures, but this would tell you some information about what could possibly happen in the future. Here there are other oscillations.
Professor, you have one more minute so we can...
Yeah, I'm done. So here there are another type of behavioral oscillations in patch 2 and stable consistency in patch 1. There are others, similar sensitivity pictures here. And maybe I'll stop because there can be, some ecological considerations that can be done, but I'll skip here. So, muchas gracias. I hope I didn't go too fast.
No, thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your talk. Now we'll open for questions from the audience. Are there any questions?
Well, maybe questions come. I should say one thing, that I gave this talk to you, but I gave it also to my students because this time is my class time. So after that, I will continue with my class if you don't mind.
Oh,
but okay.
Are there any questions from the audience? Well, I actually, Well, thank you. The talk was actually very interesting. I have done some work on two-patch epidemic models. Maybe not so much the ecological part, although actually one of my former students who's here in the talk, who's done with his PhD already. We worked on an ecological model regarding coffee plantations and stuff like that. But what would happen if instead of being a deterministic model, or not what would happen, but what do you think would add to that study if you include, let's say, a stochastic model or some stochastic noise?
Yeah, okay. I cannot really answer because I work only on deterministic models. But this is a good point anyway, because when I showed oscillations, in some cases you could see that the troughs, I mean the bottom parts, were very close to the x-axis. So the point is that in real life situations, I mean there are always fluctuations, as you say. So in that case, this kind of stochasticity, although it's not, even though it's not present in my equations, in case it occurs when the population is near zero, it could drive the system to zero. So even though I don't have a stochastic analysis, the occurrence of that phenomenon is an indication that in practical situations, the population may vanish anyway. Okay,
right, so yeah,
ecologists should take that into account.
Right, you could actually see extinction if you
sort of, although I mean I don't see it, but okay, I was looking at the chat if there was any question, but maybe not. Okay, so it has been a pleasure for me to talk. I have to abandon the session, but I congratulate you for the success of the conference, and maybe we'll see each other next year.
Yes, okay. Yes. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bobby. Okay.